You know that feeling when your heart starts racing just because the delivery guy knocks on the door? That's me. That's been my whole life. I'm Sarah, and I've spent 28 years trying to be invisible. I live in a cozy, albeit slightly overpriced, apartment in a historic building in Chicago. I love it here, or I did, until the ceilings started leaking. Now, most people would just call a plumber, demand a fix, and move on. But for someone like me, calling a stranger to come into my sanctuary and then having to talk about money, it's a nightmare. It all started on a Tuesday. I was sitting at my desk working on a graphic design project when I heard this rhythmic drip, drip, drip coming from the bathroom. I looked up, and there it was, a nasty, yellowish stain spreading across the white plaster like some kind of moldy Rorschach test. My stomach did a flip. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I spent 2 hours staring at my phone, typing and retyping a message to a local repairman I found on Yelp named Rick. His profile had 3 stars, which should have been a red flag, but his bio said fast and friendly, and for a shy person, friendly sounds safe. When I finally gathered the courage to call him, my voice was shaking. Hi, Rick. My name is Sarah. I have a leak. I think. I sounded like a child asking for permission to breathe. Rick's voice was loud, booming, and thick with a Chicago accent. Yeah, honey. I'll be there in an hour. Don't worry about a thing. He called me honey, and instead of feeling comforted, I felt small. But I didn't say anything. I just said, okay, thank you, and hung up, feeling exhausted just from that 30-second interaction. When Rick arrived, he didn't look like the photos. He was much larger, wearing a stained t-shirt, and he didn't wipe his boots before stepping onto my light gray rug. I opened my mouth to ask him to please take off his shoes, but the words got stuck in my throat. I just watched the muddy prints trail toward the bathroom. He took one look at the ceiling, poked it with a screwdriver, making a hole much bigger than it needed to be, and sighed loudly. Oof. This is bad, Sarah. Real bad. You've got a localized pipe burst behind the drywall. If we don't fix this right now, the whole ceiling is coming down by midnight. My heart hammered against my ribs. Oh no. How much will that be? I whispered. Rick scratched his chin, looking around my apartment, probably noticing my expensive iMac and my collection of art books. I could almost see the gears turning in his head. Well, normally for a job like this, with the emergency fee and materials, I'm looking at about $2,000. But since I like you, I'll do it for $1,800. Cash or Zelle up front. $1,800? I knew enough about home repairs to know that a small leak shouldn't cost that much, especially since he hadn't even checked the upstairs neighbor's unit yet. But Rick was standing so close to me, smelling of stale cigarettes and grease, and he looked so confident. I felt that familiar, suffocating pressure in my chest, the good girl syndrome. I didn't want him to think I was difficult. I didn't want to start an argument. Okay, I said, my voice barely audible. I can Zelle you. As I tapped the buttons on my phone, sending away a huge chunk of my savings, I felt a wave of nausea. Rick didn't even have a toolbox with him. He just had a small wrench and a roll of duct tape in his back pocket. He spent about 20 minutes in the bathroom. I heard some banging, a bit of swearing, and then the sound of him humming a tune. When he came out, he was wiping his hands on a rag that looked even dirtier than the pipe. All set, he said, grinning. I patched the main line. You're good for another 10 years. Just let that drywall dry out before you paint over it. I looked past him. There was water still dripping, just slower now. Rick? It's still dripping a little bit, I said, pointing timidly. He laughed, a loud, dismissive sound that made me flinch. That's just residual moisture, honey. Trust the expert. I've been doing this since before you were born. He left without giving me a receipt or any kind of paperwork. I stood in my hallway, looking at the mud on my rug and the hole in my ceiling, feeling like I had just been robbed in broad daylight, but I was the one who handed over the money with a smile. I tried to tell myself it was okay. I tried to tell myself that the leak was fixed and the money didn't matter as much as my peace of mind. But that night, the sound changed. It wasn't a drip anymore. It was a hiss. I laid in bed, staring at the shadows on the wall, paralyzed by anxiety. I told myself to get up and check it, but I was so drained from the social interaction with Rick that I just wanted to disappear into my blankets. I fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of rising tides and sinking ships. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a sound like a gunshot. Crack. Then, the sound of rushing water. I jumped out of bed, my feet hitting cold, wet carpet. I ran to the bathroom and screamed. The entire ceiling had collapsed. A torrent of water was pouring down like a waterfall, splashing onto the vanity and flooding the floor. It wasn't just a leak anymore, it was a disaster. And, because I had been too shy to question Rick's patch, my entire life was literally underwater. I stood there, frozen, water soaking my pajamas, unable to move or even call for help. The weight of my silence was finally starting to drown me. I knew then that this wasn't just about a pipe. It was about every time I hadn't spoken up, every time I'd let someone walk over me because I was too afraid to make a scene. But as I watched my laptop bag on the hallway floor start to soak up the water, something inside me, something very small and very buried, started to flicker. I didn't know it yet, but the good girl, Sarah, was about to have her last quiet night. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching the water swallow my hallway. My brain was screaming at me to do something, but my body was stuck in that familiar, polite paralysis. I finally snapped out of it when I heard a heavy, aggressive pounding on my front door. My heart didn't just race, it tried to leap out of my throat. I knew exactly who it was. Mrs. Dabrowski, my downstairs neighbor. I waded through the water, it was already ankle deep, and opened the door. Mrs. Dabrowski didn't wait for me to speak. She was 80 years old, 4'11", and had the temperament of a cornered badger. She was wearing a floral bathrobe and holding a soaking wet towel. My ceiling, she shrieked, her face turning a shade of purple I'd never seen on a human being. My antique chandelier is dripping. My Persian rug is ruined. What are you doing in here, Sarah? Having a pool party? I'm so sorry, Mrs. Dabrowski, I stammered, my hands shaking so hard I had to hide them behind my back. I had a repairman. He said it was fixed. I don't care what some grease monkey said, she yelled, poking a finger toward my chest. You call the emergency building line right now. If my insurance doesn't cover this, I'm suing you and the HOA is going to have your head. This is a historic building, not a water park. She turned on her heel and stomped away, leaving me standing in my doorway, soaking wet and humiliated. I wanted to cry. I wanted to crawl into a hole and never come out. But the water was still rushing. I finally found the emergency shut-off valve behind the toilet, twisting it until my palms bled, and the waterfall finally slowed to a pathetic trickle. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. My beautiful apartment was a wreck. The drywall was slumped in heaps on the floor, and the smell of wet plaster and old wood filled the air. I stayed up the rest of the night, using every towel I owned to soak up the mess, my mind spinning. I had paid Rick $1,800 to destroy my home. I had paid him to make Mrs. Dabrowski hate me. By 8 a.m., the building manager, Mr. Henderson, arrived with a professional restoration crew. Mr. Henderson was a tall, no-nonsense guy who wore expensive suits and looked like he didn't have a single shy bone in his body. He walked through my apartment with a clipboard, clucking his tongue. "This isn't a standard pipe failure, Sarah," he said, looking at the mess Rick had left behind. "This looks like a botched job. Who worked on this?" I felt that lump in my throat again. "A guy named Rick. From Rick's Repairs." Mr. Henderson sighed, shaking his head. "Rick? That guy isn't even licensed to work in this district. And look at this. He used a temporary automotive patch on a high-pressure water line. That's not just a mistake, that's negligence." The damage to the building structure and the unit below is going to be upwards of $15,000. 15,000? I gasped. My knees felt weak. The HOA rules are clear, Henderson continued, his voice cold. Homeowners are responsible for any damage caused by unapproved or unlicensed contractors. You're going to get a formal notice of violation by this afternoon. You'll have to appear before the board next week to discuss the fines and the repair costs. I wanted to explain. I wanted to tell him that Rick had lied to me, that he had pressured me, that I was just trying to be a good tenant. But all I could manage was a week, I understand. After he left, I sat on my damp sofa and put my head in my hands. The good girl, Sarah, had officially ruined her life. I checked my bank account. Between what I gave Rick and my monthly bills, I had less than $300 to my name. I was a freelance designer. I didn't have a steady paycheck to cover a $15,000 disaster. I pulled up Rick's number. My thumb hovered over the call button for 10 minutes. My stomach was in knots. What if he gets angry? What if he yells at me? I finally pressed call. Yeah, Rick's voice was even louder than I remembered. Hi, Rick, it's Sarah. From the apartment yesterday? The pipe, it exploded. The whole place is flooded. The building manager says you used the wrong materials and… Whoa, lady, Rick interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp and aggressive. I told you it was a temporary fix for the night. You probably messed with it after I left. My work was solid when I walked out that door. But you said it was good for 10 years. I said, my voice rising slightly, though it still sounded pathetic. Listen, kid, Rick snapped. I don't have time for this. You paid for a quick fix and you got it. Don't go trying to pin your old building's problems on me. You call me again, and I'll have my lawyer talk to you about harassment. You got it. Click. He hung up. He actually hung up on me. He had stolen my money, destroyed my home, and now he was threatening me. I sat in the dim light of my ruined living room, staring at the mud stains Rick had left on my rug. For the first time in my life, the fear wasn't the strongest thing I was feeling. Underneath the anxiety, underneath the urge to apologize for existing, there was a tiny, hot spark of something else. It was anger. I looked at my reflection in the hallway mirror. I looked like a drowned rat, pale, shivering, and defeated. I thought about Mrs. Dabrowski's pointing finger and Mr. Henderson's cold eyes. They all saw the same thing, a girl who wouldn't fight back. A girl who was an easy target. No, I whispered to the empty, wet room. It wasn't a big, cinematic moment. I didn't suddenly transform into a superhero. But I did something I had never done before. I opened my laptop, went to Google, and searched how to sue a contractor in Small Claims Court, Chicago. I spent the next 4 hours reading. I learned about breach of contract, implied warranty of workmanlike manner, and HOA bylaws. I realized that being nice was exactly what had led me here. Rick hadn't picked me because I was a good person. He'd picked me because he knew I was too shy to stop him. I went back into the bathroom, took out my phone, and started taking pictures. I took pictures of the automotive patch, the hole in the ceiling, the mud on the rug, and the water damage in the hallway. I recorded a video of the water still dripping from the broken pipe. Then, I went to the HOA website and downloaded the Notice of Dispute form. My hands were still shaking, but for once, it wasn't just from fear. It was from the adrenaline of finally deciding that I wasn't going to drown in my own silence. I had a week until the HOA meeting. A week to turn the good girl into someone Rick and this building would never forget. The next few days were the hardest of my life. Every time I thought about the upcoming HOA meeting, my throat would tighten so much I could barely swallow. My natural instinct was still to hide under the covers and hope the world forgot I existed. But every time I walked past that gaping hole in my bathroom ceiling, I felt a fresh jolt of bitterness. I couldn't let Rick win. I spent my Wednesday at the local library. I didn't want to be at home with the smell of damp plaster, and, honestly, the library felt like a safe haven for a girl who spent her life being quiet. I started researching Rick's business, Rick's Repairs. I looked him up on the Illinois Secretary of State website. Just as Mr. Henderson suspected, there was no record of a business license under that name. He wasn't a contractor, he was just a guy with a Zelle account and a predatory instinct. I found a few more reviews on obscure forums. One woman wrote, "He took my deposit and never showed up. When I called him, he threatened to come to my house and make things worse." Another person said, "He targets young women living alone. He knows they won't put up a fight." That last sentence hit me like a physical blow. He knows they won't put up a fight. He had looked at my shaking hands and my quiet voice and saw an ATM. I knew I needed more than just my own anger to win this. I needed to learn how to speak. I found a YouTube channel about assertiveness for introverts. I spent hours in a private study room at the library, practicing saying no and that is unacceptable out loud. At first, I felt like an idiot. My voice sounded thin and fake. But by the third hour, something started to change. I wasn't just saying the words, I was starting to believe I had the right to say them. On Thursday, I did something incredibly brave. Well, brave for me. I knocked on Mrs. Dabrowski's door. When she opened it, she looked ready to bite my head off again. "What? Is more water coming down?" "I have 3 buckets in my living room, Sarah." I took a deep breath, clutching my notebook to my chest. "No, Mrs. Dabrowski. I came to apologize again, but also to ask for your help." She blinked, her eyes narrowing. "Help? What kind of help?" "I'm going to the HOA meeting on Tuesday," I said, my voice only slightly trembling. "The repairman I hired lied to me. He's a scammer. He's done this to other people. I'm going to try to prove that I was defrauded so the building goes after him, not me. But I need to know exactly what happened in your unit. I need photos of the damage to show the board how serious it was." Mrs. Dabrowski stared at me for a long time. I expected her to slam the door. Instead, she stepped back and gestured for me to come in. Her apartment was filled with doilies and the smell of mothballs, but there were also huge water stains on her beautiful crown molding. "He's a crook, isn't he?" she muttered, pointing to her ruined chandelier. I knew at the moment I saw his truck. No logo, no license plate on the side. "I should have told you then, but you always look like you're about to run away if someone says hello." "I know," I said quietly, "but I'm tired of running." For the next hour, she showed me the damage. She even gave me a copy of the estimate her insurance company had sent. As I was leaving, she grabbed my arm with a surprisingly strong grip. "Listen, kid. Those people on the board? They're bullies. They like it when people come in there crying and apologizing. Don't give them that. You stand up straight, or they'll eat you alive." "I'll try," I promised. Friday was verification day. I called the plumbing company that the building usually used, the expensive, professional one. I told them I would pay for an hour of their time just to have a licensed master plumber look at the mess Rick left and write an official statement. The plumber who came, a guy named Mike, was the polar opposite of Rick. He was professional, wore shoe covers without being asked, and took one look at the pipe and started laughing, the angry kind of laugh. "This is a crime," Mike said, pointing to the automotive patch. "This isn't even for plumbing. This is meant for a radiator hose in a car. Using this in a high-pressure residential line is guaranteed to fail." He didn't just do a bad job, Sarah. He created a booby trap. I asked him if he would put that in writing. "You bet I will," he said. "Give me 20 minutes in my truck. I'll print out an inspection report for you." When he handed me that paper, I felt a strange sensation in my chest. It was a sense of power. For the first time in my life, I had evidence. I wasn't just a girl with a feeling. I had the professional opinion of a master plumber. But the real test was still to come. Rick hadn't just disappeared. On Saturday morning, I saw his rusty white van parked across the street from my building. My heart stopped. Was he following me? Was he trying to intimidate me before the meeting? I stood by my window, hidden behind the curtain, watching him. He was sitting in the driver's seat, scrolling on his phone. He looked so smug, so sure that he had gotten away with it. He probably thought I was sitting inside crying, trying to figure out how to pay the $15,000. I looked at the folder on my desk, the photos, the Yelp reviews, the plumber's report, and Mrs. Dabrowski's insurance papers. I realized that if I stayed shy, Rick would keep doing this. He would find another girl like me, another person who was too afraid to speak up, and he would ruin their home too. The old Sarah would have closed the curtains and locked the door. But the new Sarah, the one who had been practicing her power voice in the library, did something different. I grabbed my phone, walked out of my apartment, down the stairs, and straight out the front door. I walked right up to his van. My legs felt like jelly, and my vision was slightly blurring from the sheer terror of it, but I didn't stop. I reached out and knocked on his window. Rick rolled it down, looking surprised. "Oh, hey, it's the kid. You got my money for the harassment talk yet?" I didn't stutter. I didn't look at the ground. I looked him right in his squinty, dishonest eyes. "I have a report from a licensed master plumber, Rick," I said. My voice was low, but it was steady. "He calls what you did criminal negligence. I also have the contact information for 3 other people you've scammed. I'm going to the HOA board on Tuesday, and after that, I'm going to the police to file a report for unlicensed contracting and fraud." Rick's smug smile flickered. "You're bluffing. You don't have the guts." "Try me," I said. "I've already spent $1,800 on you. I have nothing left to lose." "But you? You have a lot to lose when the city finds out you're operating without a license." I didn't wait for him to respond. I turned around and walked back into my building. My heart was thumping so loud I could hear it in my ears, but as soon as the door closed behind me, I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 10 years. I hadn't won yet, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't the victim. I was the storm. The rush of adrenaline from confronting Rick lasted exactly 10 minutes before the old Sarah started whispering in the back of my mind. "What did you just do? You poked the bear. He's going to come back. He's going to hurt you." I spent the rest of Saturday night jumping at every little sound, checking the locks on my door until my fingers were sore. This is the part about overcoming shyness that people don't tell you. It's not a straight line up. It's a constant battle with the person you used to be. Sunday was the dark night of the soul. I sat in my living room, surrounded by boxes of things I'd moved to keep dry, and looked at the stack of paperwork. The HOA board meeting was only 48 hours away. In America, these board meetings can be brutal. They aren't just informal chats. They are semi-legal proceedings where people take minutes and decisions can affect your credit score or even your right to live in your own home. Our board president, a man named Marcus Vane, was known as the executioner. He was a retired corporate lawyer who lived for the rules. I knew that if I walked into that room and started stuttering, Marcus Vane would shut me down in 30 seconds. I needed to do more than just show the evidence. I needed to present it like a professional. I spent all Sunday afternoon creating a case file. Since I'm a graphic designer, I used my skills to my advantage. I didn't just bring loose photos. I created a clean, easy-to-read PDF presentation. I made charts showing the timeline of Rick's repairs versus the timeline of the collapse. I highlighted the specific sections of the HOA bylaws that Rick had violated and, more importantly, the sections that protected owners in cases of third-party fraud. Then came the hardest part, the mirror training. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror, looking at the hole in the ceiling, and I gave my presentation to my reflection. "My name is Sarah Miller, and I am here to contest the violation notice for Unit 4B, I told the mirror. My voice cracked. I looked down. "No," I told myself. "Look up. Shoulders back." I did it again. And again. And again. I stayed up until 2 a.m., practicing until I could say the words criminal negligence and contractual fraud without my voice shaking. I realized that for my whole life, I had been using my quietness as a shield to protect me from the world, but all it had really done was make me a target. Being quiet didn't make me safe, it made me invisible. And you can't defend yourself if you're invisible. Monday morning, I went to a local thrift store. I needed a battle suit. I found a sharp, navy blue blazer that fit me perfectly. When I put it on, I felt like a different person. I didn't look like the girl who apologized to the person who stepped on her foot. I looked like someone who meant business. But then, I got a text from an unknown number. "You think you're smart, Sarah? I know where you live. I know you're a freelancer. Don't make things difficult for yourself at that meeting. Just pay the fine and let it go. Last warning." My breath hitched. It was Rick. He was trying to intimidate me. My first instinct was to delete the text and hide. I felt that familiar cold wave of fear washing over me. He knew where I lived. Of course he did. He'd been inside my house. I sat on the edge of my bed, my heart thumping. I almost picked up the phone to call Mr. Henderson and tell him I'd just pay the $15,000. I could get a loan. I could work 80 hours a week for the next 2 years. Anything to make the fear go away. But then I looked at the navy blue blazer hanging on the back of my chair. I thought about Mrs. Dabrowski and her ruined antique chandelier. I thought about the other women Rick had threatened. If I backed down now, Rick wouldn't stop. He'd keep doing this, and I would be the person who let him get away with it. Instead of deleting the text, I did something the old Sarah would never have done. I took a screenshot. Then I drove to the local police precinct. Sitting in that waiting room was torture. Every time a police officer walked by, I felt like I was the one doing something wrong. But when I finally got to speak to an officer, I laid out the facts. I showed him the screenshot. I showed him the plumber's report. "This guy is a piece of work," the officer said, typing into his computer. "He's got a record for this kind of stuff in 2 other counties. We call it checkbook chasing. He finds people he thinks won't fight back and bleeds them dry." "Am I in danger?" I asked, my voice small. "Probably not physically," the officer said. "Guys like Rick are bullies. They want easy money. The moment you involve the cops and the courts, they usually scurry away like roaches. I'll file this report and give you a case number. You take this to your HOA meeting. It'll carry a lot of weight." As I walked out of the police station with that case number in my hand, I felt a strange sense of calm. The fear was still there, but it was sitting in the back seat now. I was the one driving. That night, I didn't have nightmares. I slept for 8 solid hours. I was ready for Tuesday. I was ready for Marcus, the executioner, Vane. I was ready for the board. And most of all, I was ready to stop being the girl who was too shy to live her own life. I spent the final hours before the meeting reviewing my notes. I didn't just want to win. I wanted to make sure that this building knew they couldn't push me around anymore. I checked my reflection one last time. The girl in the navy blazer didn't look shy. She looked prepared. I grabbed my laptop, my folder of evidence, and my police report. It was time to go downstairs and face the music. Or, more accurately, it was time to make them listen to mine. The community room in the basement of our building felt like a courtroom. It was cold, smelled of stale coffee, and had those flickering fluorescent lights that make everyone look like they're under interrogation. I sat in the back row, my folder gripped so tightly my knuckles were white. There were 5 board members sitting behind a long mahogany table. In the center was Marcus Vane. He looked exactly like his reputation, sharp suit, silver hair, and eyes that seemed to be looking for a reason to find you guilty. "Next item on the agenda," Marcus said, his voice echoing. "Unit 4B. Violation of Section 12, Article 4. Unauthorized contractor and secondary property damage. Sarah Miller." My heart did a violent somersault. For a split second, the room went blurry. I felt that old, familiar urge to just stand up, apologize for existing, and promise to pay whatever they wanted just so I could leave. But then I felt the weight of the police report in my folder. I stood up. As I walked to the small podium in front of the board, I noticed Mr. Henderson sitting to the side. He didn't even look at me. He was busy looking at his watch as if this were a waste of his time. "Ms. Miller," Marcus said, not looking up from his papers. "The facts are simple. You hired an unlicensed individual who caused a catastrophic pipe failure. The damage to the common areas and Unit 3B is estimated at $15,400. Under our bylaws, you are strictly liable. Do you have anything to say before we vote on the assessment? I cleared my throat. It came out as a tiny squeak. Marcus looked up, one eyebrow raised, looking at me like I was a bug. I took a deep breath, remembered the mirror in my bathroom, and adjusted the microphone. Yes, Mr. Vane. I do, I said. My voice was louder this time. Study. I opened my laptop and connected it to the room's projector. Something I'd checked was available earlier that day. A giant image of the automotive patch appeared on the screen behind me. First, I want to address the term unlicensed. Rick Miller, no relation, presented himself as a licensed professional. He committed a crime under Illinois law, home repair fraud. I am not just a negligent homeowner. I am a victim of a felony. I saw Marcus's eyes sharpen. This wasn't the "I'm sorry" speech he was expecting. This is a report from a master plumber, I continued, flipping the slide. He confirms that the repair was a deliberate booby trap. This wasn't an accident. This was a scammer who took advantage of a plumbing emergency to extort money and perform a dangerous, non-compliant repair. That's all very unfortunate, Ms. Miller, Marcus interrupted, but the bylaws state. The bylaws, I said, cutting him off, actually cutting off the executioner, also state in Section 22 that the HOA must provide a safe and secure environment. This man, Rick, has been seen on the property multiple times over the last month. He was targeting this building. I have a police case number right here. I held up the paper for a report I filed regarding his threats and his history of fraud in this county. I looked over at Mr. Henderson. And interestingly, when I checked the visitor logs for the building, I noticed Rick was let into the service elevator 3 times last week without being asked for a permit or a license. If our building security had followed the protocol, he never would have reached my door. The room went silent. I could see the board members looking at each other. I had turned the tables. It wasn't just about my mistake anymore. It was about the building's failure to protect its residents. I am proposing a solution, I said, my voice now completely calm. I have already provided the police with all of Rick's information. I am also filing a suit in small claims court. I ask the board to stay this fine and instead join me as co-plaintiffs. With the building's legal resources and my evidence, we can ensure Rick pays for the repairs to Mrs. Dabrowski's unit and the common areas. If you choose to fine me instead, you are essentially rewarding a criminal and admitting that our building's security protocols are useless. I sat down. My legs were shaking under the table, but my face was like stone. I looked at Mrs. Dabrowski, who was sitting in the front row. She gave me a tiny, almost invisible wink. Marcus Vane leaned back in his chair. He looked at the screen, then at the police report, then at me. For the first time, he looked impressed. He leaned over to whisper to the other board members. The deliberation felt like it lasted a century. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. Ms. Miller, your presentation was thorough. It appears there is more to the situation than the manager's initial report suggested. He shot a cold look at Mr. Henderson. The board will go into an executive session to discuss the legal implications of the security breach you mentioned. We will notify you of our decision by tomorrow morning. I walked out of that room feeling like I was floating. I didn't care if I hadn't won yet. I had stood my ground. I had spoken my truth in a room full of people who were paid to intimidate me. As I reached the elevator, Mr. Henderson caught up to me. Sarah, he said, his voice no longer cold, but hurried. I didn't realize he'd been bypassing the service desk. We'll need to look into those logs together. I'll have my lawyer send over the copies, Mr. Henderson, I said, stepping into the elevator. It was a lie. I didn't have a lawyer yet, but it felt amazing to say. I'm sure you understand. I need to be careful about who I trust these days. The elevator doors closed on his shocked face. I leaned against the back wall and let out a jagged, shaky laugh. I was Sarah Miller. I was shy. I was an introvert. But I was done being a victim. The next morning, I woke up before my alarm. For the first time in years, the heavy weight that usually sat on my chest, that constant, nagging anxiety about what might happen, was gone. The worst had already happened. I had been scammed, I had been flooded, and I had been threatened. And I was still standing. Around 10 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was an email from the HOA board. My hand trembled slightly as I clicked it. Dear Ms. Miller, after reviewing the evidence and the police report provided during last night's hearing, the board has voted to waive the $15,400 assessment against Unit 4B. Furthermore, the HOA will be pursuing legal action against Rick's Repairs for fraud and unauthorized entry. We have also initiated an internal review of building security protocols. We appreciate your diligence in bringing these matters to our attention. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. I didn't just win, I had changed the way the building operated. I walked into the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, looking at the hole in my ceiling. It didn't look like a disaster anymore. It looked like a trophy. A few hours later, there was a knock at my door. My heart didn't race. I didn't hide. I walked over and opened it. It was Mrs. Dabrowski. She was holding a small plate of home-baked cookies. I heard the news, she said, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Marcus Vane told me they're covering my chandelier too. You did good, Sarah. I've lived in this building for 30 years, and I've never seen anyone talk to the board like that. Most people just pay up and grumble in the hallway. Thank you, Mrs. Dabrowski, I said, taking the cookies. I think I just realized that grumbling doesn't fix pipes. She laughed. No, it doesn't. And listen, I have a nephew. He's a real plumber. Licensed, bonded, the whole thing. He's coming over to my place on Friday. I told him he's fixing your ceiling for free. Consider it a thank you for saving me the headache of a lawsuit. As the week went on, the transformation in my life was subtle, but profound. It started with small things. When I went to the coffee shop and they got my order wrong, I didn't just drink the latte I didn't want. I smiled and said, I'm sorry, I actually ordered oat milk. Could you switch that for me? And guess what? They did. And the world didn't end. I also received a call from the police officer I'd spoken to. They had picked up Rick. It turns out he had several outstanding warrants for similar scams in the suburbs. He wouldn't be bothering me or anyone else for a long time. The biggest change, however, was in my work. Being a freelance designer requires a lot of client management, which I used to hate. I used to let clients add extra work for free because I was too shy to talk about money. But on Thursday, when a client asked for a quick 3-hour change without wanting to pay for it, I sat up straight in my navy blue blazer, which I now wore even when working from home, and typed back, I'd be happy to handle those revisions. My hourly rate for additional requests is $75. Should I send over the updated invoice? They replied in 5 minutes. Sounds fair. Send it over. I realized then that the world doesn't give you what you deserve. It gives you what you have the courage to ask for. My shyness hadn't been a personality trait. It had been a habit of fear. And like any habit, it could be broken with enough practice. By Friday, my apartment was crawling with professional contractors. The sound of hammers and saws was music to my ears. I sat on my balcony, watching the Chicago skyline, feeling a sense of peace I hadn't known since I was a child. I'm still an introvert. I still prefer a quiet night with a book over a loud party. But I'm no longer afraid of the sound of my own voice. I know that if a pipe bursts, or if a bully knocks on my door, or if the world tries to tell me I'm not enough, I have the words to fight back. My name is Sarah Miller. I used to be the girl who was too shy to speak. But today, I'm the woman who makes sure she's heard. And trust me, once you find your voice, you'll never want to be quiet again.